So let's go ahead and jump back into chapter 12 here. On Monday we talked mainly about observational research methods, naturalistic observation, and participant observation. Today we're going to change gears and talk more about survey research and some different methods and issues involved in that. Today we will start off by just talking broadly about survey research and giving a little bit of a historical perspective. And then we'll talk about some issues that are especially important in survey research, which is making sure that you have a good sample. And we'll talk about 3 different types of probability sampling. And then toward the end of today's class, we'll talk more about some different types of survey research, different ways that you can do surveys, and the advantages and disadvantages of those different approaches. So, any other questions before we get started on this stuff? And then I think on Friday we'll... oh, you had a question?
Just, I have a question about, if you, survey research, like, if you wanted to, like, poll a group of people informally, then you could, like, forums and stuff. If you just, like, had, like, poll or something.
Yeah, that's a type of survey technique we'll talk about, is doing it online. Yeah, we'll get there. Alright, so, survey. Maybe that. Sure. Alright. So I think that a lot of you might have some survey methods proposed in the ideas that you've been pitching to me for your research proposals. So some of this stuff might be really useful to include in your proposals when you're writing them up.
What is a survey class?
A survey class?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a different type of thing. It's a distinction that's made between different types of college classes. Like this is a survey class where we go over a lot of material on a kind of broad level. Those are contrasted with seminar classes. Seminars are more discussion-based. You might read a couple articles and discuss them.
Interpretations of the word.
Yeah, it's just a different meaning of survey. Yeah. Right. So surveys have been around for quite a long time. If you look back through the history of psychology, a word that's commonly associated with surveys is questionnaire, and that actually comes from some of the early users of surveys who called these things questionnaires, and the word has just been altered a little bit over the decades. People have been using these things for over a century now in some form, but as the years have gone by, they've developed better methods for doing this. Some of the early surveys were kind of biased, and you wouldn't really want to place a lot of weight on their results today.
So questionnaire is just the I taken out of questionnaires, IES.
Yeah. So you can even see that Charles Darwin used some questionnaires in his research, did some survey methods. And of course, a lot of his work was observational, and he would go around the world and collect samples of different animals that he used in formulating his theory of evolution by natural selection. But he met a lot of people on his travels, and after he had gotten back home, he developed some new questions. But instead of traveling around the world again, which was it's pretty difficult and challenging and expensive today. You can imagine how it was back then. It was a very risky endeavor. So he communicated with some of the people that he had met over mail. And so he'd send these letters to people. And one of the questions that he developed later on was, are facial expressions actually evolved mechanisms? Do all human beings express emotion in the same way? And so he actually sent these letters asking this to the people that he had met in different parts of the world, and he was basically asking their professional opinion on the matter. Do you have a question?
Well, I don't think a lot of people are aware of Darwin's behavior research. Usually it focus on evolution. How much did he focus on things like
it was one of his big interests, especially later on, is how does this theory of evolution by natural selection relate to human mental processes, particularly emotions, because you can see a lot of common elements between the emotions of people and what seem to be emotionally based behaviors in animals. Yeah, but,
Did you study the
I'm not sure. I don't think he was that into the actual physiology, but I can't really speak to that as much. So anyway, that's one example, and of course later on researchers followed up on this by actually going to these isolated cultures and comparing facial expressions of people in those cultures to facial expressions of people in Western cultures, and found that in fact these things are human universals. But Darwin was one of the first to really pose this question, tried to answer it using a survey. Another classic example is if you look at the work of Sir Francis Galton, who we've talked about a few times in here before. Remember, Galton was really into collecting evidence to try to test out his ideas. So he had a really scientific approach, an empirically based approach to understanding the world. And now one question that he tried to answer using a survey is, are scientists born already having scientific interests in place? In other words, is having this intellectual curiosity innate? Or is it something that people develop as they grow and they're exposed to different ideas and things like that? Now this is an example of one that isn't necessarily the best way to answer this question, because he just sent out a survey to a bunch of scientists that he knew asking, have you always been interested in science? Do you ever remember a time when you weren't interested in science? And so again, that's not the best way to do that. We know of better ways to answer this type of question now, using like family studies and looking at genetics and things like that. But anyway, it's just another example of early survey research. And then another famous example is Stanley Hall, who really popularized the survey in American psychology. So Hall did a lot of developmental work looking at psychology in children, and he did a survey method to figure out what basic information children know, children of different ages. So he would have caretakers ask children questions like, what's an island? Trying to figure out, do children know what an island is? Just these general knowledge type things. Where are your ribs? So they know that their ribs are right here. What do children actually know? Because a lot of this stuff as adults we kind of take for granted, we know what these things are, but he wanted to know at what point are children, at least in his sample, learning these things.
Isn't that tell you more about like the education that they go through rather than how much a child can know? I mean, like.
Yeah, well, he wasn't interested in like. Well, that's really what he was studying is, generally speaking, have children at these different ages learn these basic concepts, and he wasn't interested as much in the cause of the learning, so why they knew these things. He just wanted to know what they knew. It's a lot of times survey research can be used as a good starting point for more detailed investigations of these things.
Okay, so if you want to advance experiment, but like you need to know certain things, like what kids knew.
Yeah, you can start off with a survey. And so a lot of people have questioned the value of surveys over the years because of the fact that the data that they yield can be relatively subjective, especially if you compare it to the type of data that you get from pure behavioral research, where you're actually looking at a person or an animal behaving in a particular environment. You're studying real behavior. But this isn't to say that surveys are useless. Like I said, they can serve as a great starting point, and there are some things that you can study with surveys that you really can't study using other types of methods. Now, let's take a step back here and talk broadly about exactly what a survey is. So a broad definition here is going to be That a survey is just a structured set of questions that measures some psychological variable for our purposes. And so it might be a set of questions that's designed to measure people's attitudes about a certain topic, to measure people's beliefs, the values that they hold. And so if you're interested in studying these types of things, attitudes, beliefs, and values, you have to realize that you can't necessarily measure those by looking at behavior. You might make inferences about people's attitudes and values based on their behavior, but you're not really directly measuring them in that way. You can also measure behavioral tendencies or intentions to behave, willingness to perform certain actions, self-reported willingness. And willingness and intention are sometimes referred to as behavioroid measures, so just an OID after behavior. And so they yield some data that's similar to actual behavior, but you're just looking at intentions rather than pure action.
Didn't we discuss like that, like the things that could happen, like if you ask for behavior, some behavioral tendencies they might choose the better.
Yeah, we'll be recapping some of those things today, some problems with surveys. We'll get back there. So, really, survey research can be limited in some aspects, but it's an ideal method if you're trying to study factors that can't be observed directly, or if you, or that would be impossible or impractical to observe. So you can have people imagine a certain situation that they have never been in, and ask them, how do you think you would act in this situation? Okay. Now their response might not reflect how they would really act, but it gives you some starting point. It gives you some idea of how they might act. Okay. And so a lot of personality measures, just looking at individual differences between people, will give folks a set of hypothetical situations and have them agree or disagree with a stated opinion on these different situations. Now, as I said when I was giving the overview for today's class, when you're doing survey research, it's especially important. Oh man, I didn't animate my slide. You need me to go back? Sure. It's especially important to make sure that you've got a good sample. Okay. And that hasn't necessarily been the case for all of the research that we've talked about throughout the semester.